and omega kind of shtick. So having begun with Darrel Preble talking about why it's important to think about alternative energy, and in particular solar power satellites, in this session, we return now to Darrel to talk about how we might undertake such developments. Darrel.
Thank you. This session is about the how, and see if I can get the presentation up. We've had the privilege of looking at a lot of trees for the last few hours. We're trying to focus in this part on the forest, if you might say. If you talk to someone, either in NASA or in Washington, you're very likely to have someone say, well, the space transportation is too expensive, you can't do it. Or they may say, photovoltaics are too expensive, you can't do it. And other such comments. And they're true. It's quite true. However, if you talk to some of these space transportation designers and you ask them, can you build space transportation that will deliver to orbit, say at $100 per pound? They say, well, if you can order 1,000 of these today, we'd love to. But we don't have anybody that's available to sign a check to build 1,000 of these today. Gerard O'Neill, the last decade, noted that, in fact, there is no constituency for space power. There is no organization built. There is no current agency. There is no charter that could support what needs to be done for space solar power. The organization that really needs to be built, we call Sunsat Corporation. It is modeled precisely after ComSat Corporation, which built communication satellites and created a $100 billion industry. Mike Griffin noticed that NASA is kind of expensive to order from. You probably wouldn't want NASA building your SUV. So there is, in fact, no company really prepared to assume this financial risk. Not Boeing, not PG&E, not anyone, really. We faced this problem before in this country. During the Civil War, we chartered a company called the Transcontinental Railroad to cross the country with both rail and telegraph. This is a picture of that, part of that process. We have to do the same sort of process now. They had a difficult time building this in the middle of the Civil War, 1862. This would be the first statement of the Sunsat Act. The Congress declares it's the policy of the United States to establish, in conjunction and in cooperation with other countries, as expeditiously as practicable, a commercial space solar power satellite system as part of environmentally enhanced and improved global electric power generation and networks, to be responsive to public needs and national objectives serving the growing electric power needs of the United States and other countries, which will contribute to world peace, understanding, harmony, and increased sustainable electric power generation and economic development. As we know, there are a wide variety of key technologies which must be simultaneously developed and brought to low-cost structure delivery in order for us to be able to build space power. First among these, you might say, is space transportation. So if you chartered Sunsat Corporation, you'd immediately go talk to the space transportation companies and begin planning the delivery schedule to get to the learning curves that you have to have for all of these: space transportation, thin film, wireless power. These are some of the other key areas: telerobotic assembly, nearly autonomous operation, advanced flight controls and satellite geometry, superconducting cables. There are now second generation superconducting out, which you can order. And in fact, in the sun's shadow, it maintains liquid nitrogen temperatures, so you could build much of your PMAD from second generation superconducting. How much? You'll have to look at the amperage loads. Obviously, high loads are what you're going to want to use superconducting for. The other interfaces to structures, I'm talking about commercial agencies on Earth, would be handled through a separate company. We call this SPARCO. This would essentially be a users group of Rakuten owners. Another agency that we'd like to see created would be a Lunar Development Authority, which would be a joint public-private agency. Again, similar corporation, but totally different purpose. Sunsat is focused like a laser on building power satellite company, building a power satellite system. A Lunar Development Authority would be focused like a laser on commercial development of the cislunar environment. And if you're, I don't know, Mr. Benson or someone that wants to go off and maybe put a hotel on the moon, wherever, they may be happy to put $100 million into Lunar Development Authority. If they do that, then they should have a seat on the board, because there should be probably much government funding going in that direction, but it should be shared control, because there are shared interests. This is a chart of possible curves for getting to low cost at high flight rates. Mr. Musk and the owners of Dnepr are now delivering and taking orders for the, let's see, this point right here. This is the old systems that we're familiar with. This chart came from Gordon Woodcock. We know that learning curves, once established, and we can see these learning curves repeated for photovoltaics and many industries, will follow these kinds of curves for successive generations. Perhaps Mr. Musk's vehicle will follow this curve. Eventually we'll get to this curve, but we're going to need help as far as getting Sunsat Corporation going in providing lower cost structures for launch. So we suggested legislation as part of this for an 85% launch subsidy, and the initial satellites that would be built for commercial use would have to be built at higher cost structures. Eventually we're going to get, in this type of range, 42,000 flights a year, which will deliver lower cost. This chart is the same, you'll notice, learning curve for photovoltaics. This is the history that has already been established in declining costs. Right now, we are establishing, as we speak, a lower cost curve for thin film, which is about 100 times thinner as far as the business part of the photovoltaic process. Now, in order to get to where we would like to be over in this area, we probably need subsidies. Right now, the great state of California, has established subsidies for terrestrial photovoltaics in the amount almost $3 billion, which is far in excess of what the United States government has been doing. So we applaud the great state of California. In fact, we would like to challenge the administration, Bush administration and Congress, to do something similar for space photovoltaics, to in fact subsidize space photovoltaics as part of the Sunsat Act to provide access to lower cost space PV that we must have. Space PV is a little bit different, and we have a paper online on the Space Solar Power Workshop detailing that, thanks to the work that was done at the Air Force Research Labs by Donna Krall-Sent. But we've got to get into this range down here that will be established as we get to high volume manufacturing. So there, in fact, may be other agencies and companies that would like to order this. So we're looking at, again, say an 85% structure subsidy for new and private businesses, such as Sunsat Corporation, which are contracting for space photovoltaic arrays. We've got to cut the costs in order to get space solar power built. But they all follow these similar models. With the volume comes lower cost. These are, again, references back to why. And in fact, if you go online, you'll find a copy of the Sunsat Act. If you look on the flyer there, we can get a copy of Sunsat Act, which we are trying to get sponsored in Congress right now. This legislation is very closely modeled after the ComSat Act, except that instead of referring to communication satellites, it refers to power satellites. It also talks about, in the legislation, Sparco Corporation, which would be a direct antenna owners, users, marketing organization that would be affiliated loosely with Sunsat, because Sunsat would actually own the solar power satellites. If you are now the president of the Philippines Electric Power Company. If you are the president of the Philippines Electric Power Company or another country, and you talk to Sparco, maybe you've been a member of Sparco, you've been to some of their user meetings, and you realize that you need to get a couple of extra gigawatts for the growing population of your nation. And you talk with them and discuss a lot of issues, regulatory issues, environmental issues, communications interference issues, and so forth. All of these are the prerogative and business of Sparco, because they speak for the rectenna owners. They speak for, in a very large, real sense, for Sunsat's presence on Earth. Sunsat is interested in delivering power to Earth. That's its focus. Sparco is interested in what the users, the customers, want to do, and what they need to do to interface to Sunsat Corporation. You're probably not familiar with how public power companies work, but they are the most capital-intensive business on the planet. They have a lot of concrete in the ground. What that means is that there's a lot of money sitting in the ground. And in my humble opinion, what they've been doing with deregulation has been not in the public interest, but that's another discussion. But if you look at the website, you'll find a lot of the background necessary to move towards sponsoring this key legislation. It also will talk about SPARCO. Since the government will be providing funding, that is, we will be providing funding through Uncle Sam, there will be representation of key government agencies, such as probably NASA. NASA may be, I don't know, certainly involved probably in lunar development, and they certainly have key expertise. And while aerospace employment has been declining the last 50 years, it's probably not in the best interest of what we need to be doing as far as space power development. However, until we get proper structures in place which can properly employ people, I suspect history will continue as it's been doing the last few years. So we need to get Sunsat Corporation chartered. If you look at the website, you'll find, when you go into the legislation, you can see how the director structure is set up, how stocks, financing of it would be set up, bond equity, and so forth. Kind of dull stuff to put on the screen. I'm not going to do that. But you have business plans that will be talked about, because each component area that would be delivering technology to Sunsat Corporation, such as photovoltaic manufacturers, would have a strong interest in discussing, in fact, in planning how this will take place, because they're the ones who actually have to deliver the hardware. Sunsat Corporation would not be building rockets. They won't be making photovoltaics. Just as ComSat Corporation did, they would probably have a laboratory which was focused on wireless power transfer. Now, right at this moment, there is a cooperative research and development agreement going on between Sharp Corporation, which is the largest builder of photovoltaics in the world, and Sandia Laboratories. They are focused on research and development for photovoltaics and fuel cells. A number of people have expressed an interest. I think it's a good idea to consider another cooperative research and development agreement with interests in this country and scientists and engineers in this country who are interested in wireless power transfer, because the friends that I have visited in Japan are also, and probably they're more advanced in some areas in wireless power transfer than we are. But most of the work that might be applicable is probably in the black sector in this country, such as space-based radar. So I can't put that on the website. But the point is, we do need cooperative research and development, because there are people around the world that have valuable contributions to make in a wide variety of these technologies. And undoubtedly they would like to be participants, as, for example, Boeing is having wings built in Japan, as the International Space Station has modules from Europe and Japan. And they undoubtedly, I know, they would like to invest in such a corporation. Now, as far as nations like Iran, for example, we would love to have them order a rectenna, but I kind of would be surprised if they would be permitted to invest in Sunsat Corporation at this point. So there is a wide variety of involvements which have to be resolved in order to move forward with the corporation. But the time is to do it is now. We really need to get moving. And I'll entertain questions at this point.
It's the end of Friday.
Yes.
I heard some U.S. organization called like the Apollo Initiative or something, or
Open organization?
Apollo Initiative, they're pushing for.
Yes, I've heard of them. I'm familiar. I've been to the website a couple times.
Yeah. And they are pushing for energy independence. There's no solar power satellite.
Right. I don't have the impression that that is one of their favorite choices. So there are many interesting alternative power technologies, but there are none which are clean, safe, and baseload, except space solar power. Yes?
You said you needed 42,000 flights per year.
Yeah, that's a nominal number.
How big will those flights be?
I'm guessing that's going to be 10 kilogram, 10-ton load, 10 metric tons.
This is to LEO or GEO?
But it would all have to go to GEO. Now, exactly how this is handled, probably boost from LEO.
So it's cheaper to go direct.
Whatever. Yeah. I'm not going to design the space transportation system right here.
One other question.
Yeah.
There's a group called Sunsat Energy Council. Sunsat, which is
Yeah, I think Randall's plans on that.
And how does your name relate to that group?
Well, you know, I talked to Peter Glazer. I exchanged a few emails with him, and there is no connection between Sunsat Energy Council, which is the United Nations NGO, I don't think that's where it is, and Space Solar Power Workshop, which is a loose volunteer organization which is international. In my opinion, the United Nations is not an appropriate vehicle for advancing this work.
But more properly, I'm the current president of the Sunsat Energy Council.
Well, we appreciate your
And the
presence.
The SEC is in fact the only non-governmental organization. It is chartered under the UN, but it's actually incorporated in the U.S. As a 501c3, and it is the only one which is actually, the purpose of which is to promote space solar power and power from space.
Notably, it's the United Nations, has special United Nations privileges, though.
Thank you, John.
You know, it seems to me that one of the big advantages of a space-based solar power system, correct me if I'm wrong, would be its movability. Since we can't well predict what changes of baseload power may be, especially in the third world. And if you have a movable system, you can better accommodate variations in baseload development to the solar power satellite system than you can to any ground-based system. Is that true or not?
You're asking me, can they be moved?
Yes.
Well, it's not too hard to change the global. I mean, if you're within the footprint, you're invisible.
The beam can be moved very readily.
Yeah.
But how
So,
far? I mean, can it be moved from
North America to South America,
or from Africa to South America?
and within the field of view.
yeah. The real answer to your question is, if you want to move it from, I don't know, Havana, Cuba to St. Louis, you're going to want to ask the people of St. Louis, do you have an appropriate rectangle there?
Sure. I
Right?
understand that.
And in fact, one of the more interesting ideas is the idea of load quality. So in fact, the system deployed over the equator over Mexico could provide power to Maine in the morning and to Alaska in the evening. In the evening in Maine,
If the electric power companies and those were
prepared to accept.
prepared.
Right. But you can follow you could
track the load to a considerable amount.
You'd probably write a contract with, the appropriate power companies to deliver it, and they're likely to have control of how you move it,
Well, also in terms of planning.
since they're paying the bill.
Like, for example, the nuclear power, when it was still being developed in this country, it had something like a 20-year lead time to predict baseload demand. In 20 years from the time of startup design, if you have a movable system and some slack or some excess generating capacity, then you remove uncertainties, and it makes insurance companies happier, and development authorities and bond granting authorities happier and less nervous about.
Also, I had some friends in the conventional energy business looking at third world opportunities, and for them, one of the risks was to deploy their assets in those countries, and then they can be nationalized.
Yeah, that's why Sparco is created as it is, because if you are Mr. Philippines National Electric Company, you would own DirectNet. You have a strong vested interest in maintaining delivery to that DirectNet, because that's your business, that's your property, that's your regulatory environment. That's, in fact, you probably chose how the beam is delivered, because there may be 2 or 3 alternate varieties. Some may choose to have a laser beam delivery, but it's like selling used cars here, because you want to have a variety of viable delivery options. This one we have none. But there are, several which are leading ones, which might be chosen if you had to build one next year.
Okay.
Great.